let me introduce you to the concept of components in React. Basically, in modern web application, what we do, we split pieces of code inside other files, what we call components. Why do we do that? Let me give you an example. Let's say that in app.jsx, I'm going to build my whole application. So I will have a lot of code written inside only one file. We got a lot of problems doing that. The first problem is that the readability is terrible. If I got tons of lines, like hundreds of thousands of lines inside the file, it's very difficult for me to identify where is the piece of code I'm trying to fix or improve. So what we do, we split that into several files. The second reason and the second problem is that I can copy-paste a lot of code inside my application where I would need to have only one piece of code somewhere and reuse it everywhere. The components help to reuse the code that we already wrote before. So there is two aspects. The first aspect, it's about the UI and the design, but the second aspect can be also about the functionality. Let's say that a component can be reused everywhere, but it can carry also its own functionalities. Think about a calendar, for instance. The calendar is always the same everywhere inside your app, but it's only one file that carries its own logic, fetch its own events, carries its own functions. Okay? So here we can think about components as blocks, and all those blocks, they are building the whole application. So with components, we can create reusable and modular code inside our app. Okay, so what we're going to do here, we are going to create a first component, and we are going to deep dive into components by also creating a component not inside a Create React app. So here I use the CLI of React to create this app, but I will show you how to create a component also in an HTML file, for instance. Okay, so if I go to component here, I can create a first component called header.jsx, exactly the same extension as my app down here. And here, this header.jsx will be written exactly like my app. So the first thing is to actually export default, a function, and here I'm going to call it header. And here, from now on, I got a component in JSX that will be used inside my app. So I can return here, for instance, a new header. And here I'm going to write here, for instance, header coming from components. And there we go, we've got that. So now I got two separate files, one in components, another one at the root of my project. What I would like to do is to import this header inside my app.jsx. So what I can do here is just to remove, let's say that I'm going to remove this header and replace it by my header component. I'm just going to open here a tag and I'm going to use the name of my component. And we can see here that VS Code is retrieving the component I'm looking for, the /component/header. So I'm going just to type enter and I'm going to close here. And there we go, we've got my header coming from component. And we can see here that inside my app, I'm using this piece of code. So I only have one line to call this component. And here I can put as many lines as I want. Also, what I can do here is to have my own style. So let's say that I'm going to put BG neutral 500. Okay, suddenly I got my own style that has not been applied directly in here. Okay. That's the first thing. We created our first component, but we can go deeper. Let's say that I would like to create a component inside a component. Is that possible? Of course it is. So let's say that I'm going to create a new folder, and this folder is going to call menu. And inside menu, I'm going to create an index.jsx. Okay, here, what's gonna happen is that this index.jsx will be called as a menu. So I'm going to write export default function menu here, exactly like I would do, and it's always the same. And I would have a div, and this is a menu. There we go. So now you understood that I got a component menu. So I'm going to come back here inside my header, and down there I'm going to call menu again, exactly like I did in app. And we can see that I'm importing menu exactly like a component. And we can see here that suddenly I got actually app that is calling header, that is calling menu, and I could go on like this and on and on and on. So the main question you would ask is, Guillaume, why would we need and when do we need to create a component? Well, this is a question of architecture of your project. So if you open here your components folder, this is where normally there is the whole logic, the business logic, I would say, from your application. So if you need, for instance, a Teams folder because you have a Teams component, what you would do is to create a teams.index.jsx with exactly the same, so export default function Teams, okay, and you would return here a div called Teams. And if you got here inside these Teams actually members, you would have members, and then you would have an item.jsx, for instance, and you would import these members inside Teams, etc., etc. So we know that when we want to change something in Teams, we would have to go to the folder Teams. So when do we need to create components? You need to create components when you reach a point where the code is difficult to read, difficult to handle, and you need to split it inside different pages, inside different pieces of UI. All right? So here we create components in order to improve the developer experience, but also in order to work with different states. Let me give you an example. Here I got a header, and if I copy paste 2 times this header, I suddenly got 2 headers. However, in those 2 headers got a different state. Okay, let me give you a tricky example. If I open my header and inside here I put random number, and if between brackets I put mat.random and I type enter, we can see that my header that is called, the first one, got 1 number here, and the second one got a different number. Why? Simply because those 2 headers got their own scope. It means that the state of one header at the moment when he is initiated is different from the second one when he is called. And this is why we got a random number. And I can upload as much as I want. You will see that the 2 numbers will be different. However, the string random number stays because this is me who define the string here that we got. So here we can see that headers got different state. This is why we're going to see in the next lesson that we can pass what we call props. The props help us to pass here text, data, whatever, to tell him, hey, this is the state that you should have. Okay, so I can call as many components as I want. And I can go deeper like this into the architecture, but every component got its own scope, all right? So this is a bit tricky. I would need to work actually on the scope of every component. But what I can do also with component, if I would like to, is to loop through this component. It's totally possible. Again, I'm going to give you an example. So let's say that I'm going just to remove that and I got my header with a random number. And let's say that I would like to loop through actually an array, okay, or probably a number, okay? So let's say that I would have as a loop, I would have 9 loops, okay? And no, I'm not going to do like this. I'm going to do more like an array because probably you would like to loop through an array to display different components like this. Okay, so we learned previously that we can loop here, okay? Here we can loop like this in JSX, and we can return actually, for instance, something. And here we can see that instead of something, which would be a span, a div, an image, or whatever, we can loop like this and render components. And look at that, depending on the number that we got. So here, what we would need to do, which is mandatory, of course, is to put either the index or either a key that helps React to identify every element that is rendered. We can see that he looped actually 10 times here and rendered actually 10 times the header. Okay, so you can definitely loop and actually render like this components, which here is header. Okay, I'm just going to remove that. Another thing that I can do is to store my component. In React, I can store my component into a variable and use it. So I can type here my component, for instance, and I can put my header like this, okay? And now I can use this component directly inside my JSX. So if I put my component like this, suddenly we've got the component that is stored, which is the header. Let's say that if I'm doing that, we can see here that we still got different numbers, because every time the component will be called, we will call actually a new instance of this header. All right? So when we use actually components inside other components, we call that components nesting. Okay, we nest components inside others. And this is a bit tricky because in React, everything is about components. So if we go to app.jsx, or if we go to main.jsx, we can see here that we use React DOM to call root and to push actually our app down here. Here we can see pages are looking the same as components because they are basically the same. They are this kind of blocks, okay? So when we create components, it's to separate files and pieces of UI and functionality for a better organizations. And you will always need to export by default your component. We're going to see later that we can do a lot of things with components, but the most important is that React component should be ideally pure functions, okay? It should not modify external data or return the same results for the same inputs, okay? This is what you're going to see on the official documentation. Of course, you can do like you want, but this approach really helps you to prevent bugs and just increase your code predictability, okay? So as the project is going to grow, you will need to separate all your piece of code into different components. If you remember well, in the previous course, I created this example.html that is calling simply React directly inside an HTML file, totally outside of our example here of our project with Create React App. I can do exactly the same. I can use external components directly an HTML file. So here we got the example. So it's a little bit small, but here you can see that what I'm going to do here is to call 2 times my script with TextBabel. And I'm creating here on the top my external component here, which is defined just here. And under this, I can call external component exactly like I would do inside my Create React App. The difference is that I don't need to import external component because here in this file, we are on the same scope. We have the same state. So here, this external component that I'm calling just down here is actually declared just up here. So I can directly use this external component down here. It's easier for me because it's just up here. Let's finish on a last explanation and a last practice that I would like to show you now. Let's remove those 2 components here, so coming from here. And on the top of my app file, what I would do is probably to create a component, but inside this app.jsx. Is that possible? Absolutely. So here I'm going to put my custom component, okay? And here I'm just going to create a function that is going to return some JSX. So I would put here a paragraph, hello from my custom component, okay? So here I got a function that is returning some JSX. Can I call it directly down here? So if I put my custom component and I save, can I call it? Does it work? Well, here it's not working. It's really weird because if I change my custom component to a capital letter, suddenly we've got hello from my custom component. We got the component that has been called. Well, React only makes a difference between a function and a component here by using this capital letter. So this is a tip that I'm giving to you. Here you can declare a component as long as it is with a capital letter. There's a lot of other explanation, but this is just a tips for you. Okay, so we got my custom component here, and we can see that directly in app.jsx, I stored my component, my custom component. Why would I do that? I would do that because probably I would have a piece of functionality or a piece of UI or functional design that I would like to just use inside my app.jsx file. But I don't want it to have it inline down here because it's very complex and it would make the code unreadable. So I put it on the top. You will see that very often in React application. Of course, if I want, I can export this function, not as a default because there's only one export default. But I could export my custom component. So if I go to main.jsx, what I can do, I can call my custom component coming from app.jsx. And we can see that 2 times I got hello from my component, but one is in app and the other one is outside. And I could do that everywhere. Now the only thing that I need to remember is that my custom component is only on app.jsx and not inside my components folder. All right, this was a good introduction to components. If you want to have more details about that, you can go on react.dev, or you can go also on legacy React documentation. That gives you a lot of insight. Now what we would like to do is to pass data from a component to another. Or in other words, we would like to share the state between several components. We would like that every component, every header component that we saw, got the same number and not a random number. Okay? How we would do that? We would do that with props, and just look at this props listen because I'm going to give you a lot of tips. I'm going to tell you how to pass data from parents to children, of course, but also I'm going to give you the best practices.